We have all been uniquely and lovingly created in the image of God and called to live in fusion with Him and with one another. I'm Robert Ricciardelli, and welcome to the Converging Zone. Welcome to the Converging Zone. We've got a great show today. We've got back with us Dr. Mary Neal, the spinal surgeon who went to heaven and came back. She's the author of a book, To Heaven and Back. Welcome to the show today, Dr. Mary Neal.
Thank you.
Mary, welcome back.
Thank you.
Boy, we had such a good time on episode 1. If you guys haven't seen it, you got to see it. But so many questions that I have come up, about your experience that I think the audience would find fascinating. One of the questions that came up initially was, we talked about the 15 minutes that was recorded, but most likely 30 minutes that you were gone, checked out with the heavenly presence, with the presence of God. Talk about this resuscitation. We talked earlier about these experts that you've talked in the field about resuscitation efforts that normally don't succeed. Talk about that.
Well, it was interesting because I thought, well, you do CPR and that works and there it is. And I will say that even as a physician, I've thought that CPR is pretty effective in the field. And what I've come to realize is that it really isn't. Last summer, we were doing some filming in Idaho, and the producer was interviewing the guys who resuscitated me. And the dad of the group has been doing this for 30 years. And she asked how many times he's been involved with water rescue, water recovery, water events. And he thought about it and he said, well, I don't really know, but at least a couple of hundred or more. And the follow-up question to that was really interesting to me because I'd never thought about it. And she asked him, how many of those have been successful? And he said, well, that's easy. 1, mine.
Wow.
And they are the first people who step back and say that they had nothing to do with it. They were physically the ones doing the resuscitation, but they don't feel like it was their doing at all. They absolutely believe that this was God's doing. And it's interesting because even in the field outside of water rescue, CPR actually isn't that effective, which is surprising.
Yeah, because you'd think there'd be a lot more successes on that.
Right.
Now, this happened in 1999,
yes.
Right? And you wrote the book just a few years ago.
I just wrote it last year.
Last year. What took so long to write the book? Why did it take so long to write the book?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's a question that many people have asked. And the answer is pretty simple. Number one, in my defense, my children were very young. And I felt that my not wanting to return was an important part of the story. And I never wanted them to think that they weren't enough of a reason for me to return. And so I really didn't talk about it because I didn't want them to overhear me saying that. So I do think that's a legitimate reason. Yeah. But the real reason is that I really didn't want to do it. I am a spine surgeon, mother, wife. I am active in terms of sports. I didn't have the time. I didn't have the desire to write. And indeed, writing is something I knew was expected of me. And it certainly is a very efficient way to share my experience with other people, which I knew was one of the prime mandates for my return. But my world and the publishing world had absolutely no overlap. And I really just didn't want to do it. And so I came up with all sorts of great excuses and rationalizations why I didn't need to do it and didn't want to do it. And one day in 2009, it was as though God picked up my bed and threw me out and said, now is the time you are going to do this. And I will say that from that point to this, it has been an incredible journey of obedience. And I got up and I wrote. And I would get up at 4 in the morning and I would write for several hours until it was time to get the kids up and do the whole morning routine. And I was absolutely compelled. And I just sort of poured it out and wrote the whole thing in about a week. And at that point said, okay, good, I'm done. And then I sort of came back to it and said, no, it was this sense of, no, you're not done, finish it, like truly finish the job. And I did, and I finished what I felt was the final manuscript several hours before my oldest son was killed. And his death was something that I had been told about, not precisely when it was going to happen or how it was going to happen, or even that it was absolutely going to happen, because although God does have a plan for our lives, and I believe that we come here with an outline of that plan, there are branch points. Plans change, and God can change things as he wants.
Yeah.
And certainly I had hoped that the plan for my son had changed. And people have asked many times, well, how could you possibly go through your life knowing that you're going to lose your son? And my response is pretty straightforward. Number one, of course, I hope the plan would change. But secondly, I had an absolute trust that the promises of God were true.
You were prepared for it.
I was absolutely prepared, not only because I had been told about it, but really the importance was having made this transformation from faith that the promises are true to an absolute and complete trust that God's promises are true. And some of those promises involve the fact that there is a plan for each one of our lives, and that is a plan that is one of hope and has a future. And I knew without doubt, without any questioning, that if indeed the plan was for my son's death, that there would be great beauty in his death. Remember, I had already seen in my own life how an event had this unseen ripple effect 35 times removed. And I knew the same would be true with my son's life and his death if it occurred.
And it's interesting, I was reading the book that even your son had a knowing that his life would not go into the 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s.
He did. He actually told me when he was very young, 4 or 5, that he wasn't going to live to be 18. And when he had said that to me, he said it in a way that absolutely hit my very core. And I never forgot that. And so when I was kicked out of heaven and told about the expectations of my role when he died, it didn't come as a surprise. And perhaps that's why I was able to listen to what they had to say and take it to heart instead of responding with, what?
Yeah.
But I absolutely believe that God's timing is perfect.
Yeah.
And even though I spent all those years justifying why I didn't write this book, I actually believe that God's timing is perfect. And by finishing the manuscript just before his death, I was able to really fulfill those expectations of me at that time. And I'm not sure that would have been true earlier. I had been very protective of how much I allowed myself to really think about and experience my memories, because it's very alluring. It's very alluring to think about heaven and the future. But the fact is, we all have work to do right here, right now.
Yep.
And we need to be about that business. We can't be spinning our wheels and, off in La La Land.
That's good.
And so I actually think that it was great because when I wrote the manuscript, I allowed myself to not only remember everything in detail, but fully re-experience that part of my life. And it allowed me to really respond appropriately at the death of my son and really help other people see God in it and see the beauty.
Well, I see the timing of the book as perfect, such as you, because you talked about ripple effects. And a lot of the ripple effects, if you would have wrote it earlier, wouldn't have been able to be told.
Right.
Because you were able to bring in what's going on
Right.
up until today because of what happened.
Yes.
So I think that's another reason why the timing was perfect. That's great. So tell us some about those ripple effects. Talk about some of the ripple effects of what happened and how that extended into your family and to your friends that experienced this with you and others.
Well, I can talk about that, but I would tell you I think the most profound effect are ones that I'll never know. When I think back on my life, and I'm sure the same is true of yours, you can recall events or people who said things to you that had an impact that was way out of proportion to what it should have had. And I feel like that's actually the biggest thing. And I've had the privilege of having feedback from many people who have said, gee, I heard your story, or now I've read your book, or I knew your son, and let me tell you how it changed my life. And that is an incredible privilege. And that's why I don't feel at all bad promoting this book, because I really don't feel like it's my story.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm the one living it, but I really feel like it's God's story, and God is using it to inspire people to find God in their own lives. And that's really my goal in all of this, because I believe that you can't have faith by association. Yeah. You know, people have faith because they grew up in a family that had faith, or they have friends who go to church, or they go to church and they're around people who say they have faith. But so many people have what I call sort of faith by association. It's not deeply rooted, and it's not part of their daily life and part of what they truly are. And what I hope is that by reading this book or by hearing my story, people are inspired to say, I'm going to look at my own life. Yeah. Let me look at my life and see the ways that God has loved me, guided me, protected me. And I believe it's only when you really see God working in your own life, and I believe anyone who looks will find God working in their life. But I think it's only when you see God actually working in your own life, not someone else's, that you make this incredible transformation from faith to trust. Yeah. And I think when you make that transformation, then it changes everything.
It's a game changer. It's
a game changer because you have to get to this point where you don't need any more proof. You know, we all want a little more proof and a little more proof and a little more proof. But the fact is, at some point, you have to look at everything and say, I'm good. I commit. And when you do that, and part of that is accepting that, you know what, not only is there life after death, but all the promises are true, then it changes the way you experience every moment of every day. Because everything really matters. Everything really is part of God's plan, not only for your life, but God's plan for the world.
You know, what's interesting is you were that person that you were talking about that you're trying to reach before you experienced this. You were one of those people that said, yeah, I have a little bit of experience, that I believe, but it was like not really a participation.
Right, I would agree. I took my kids to church, and I think I was really typical because I, of course, wanted to be a better parent than my parents had been to me. And I did take my kids to church, and I tried to make them understand that it's more than just a Sunday morning sort of thing. But despite making these repeated commitments to say, okay, no, I'm going to start really integrating it into our family life, you know, you get to the end of the day, and after you've taken care of all the details of daily life, you're tired and you've failed again.
Yeah.
And I think that is really, really common. Or you think about your spirituality as this part of what you are, instead of it really is what you are and everything else comes out of it.
Integration of all of life.
Right, a total integration, even prayer. You know, I will say that before this experience, I had this idea of prayer that it was something that, okay, I set out this part of time and I pray, or I read the Bible, but it's this little blacked out period of time, this segment of my life. But I would say that now, rarely do I set aside time to pray. I feel like I'm in constant prayer.
Yeah.
I feel like my life is a prayer, and I feel like what that really means is that I am constantly listening, and I'm constantly trying to obey. And it's really been an incredible journey of obedience, an incredibly exciting, wonderful, adventurous journey of obedience, because God really does have a plan that is one of hope. Yeah. Even writing this book, I had this idea that, okay, well, I'm supposed to write the book, so I'll write it, and then a publisher will come knocking on my door, and there it is. Yeah. Check off the list. You know, I don't have time for this sort of thing. And it was an incredible journey for me, because at each point in time when I said, well, I don't have any idea how I'm supposed to get to the next step, I would say, well, okay, God, you want this done? Let's have it. Yeah. Put someone in my life. And someone would show up. And then I finally came to the end of that process, and it was time to publish it. And I said, well, okay, I'm waiting for the publisher to call, not knowing that that doesn't happen. And so I was very frustrated one day, and I said, well, this is ridiculous. You know, if you want this published, you need to do something about it. Got in my car, turned on the radio, and it came on really loudly to this Christian music station, and it came on to the refrain of a song that said, I refuse to wait for someone else to do what God has asked me to do myself. Mm. And the beauty in that for me was, in this journey of obedience, my response was not to turn the station. My response was, oh, really? And I followed through with it.
Yeah. And we're thankful you did, because it's a wonderful book, and it will bring hope to those who read it. You know, what was your view of, I was thinking about your view beforehand of heaven. What was that view versus what is your view today? And we've talked about what your view is today, but I'm kind of curious of how much it changed between what your perspective was prior.
I don't really think I spent much time thinking about it. I mean, I
just knew it existed.
Hoped that there was life after death, and I believed that there was something more. But I don't think I spent a lot of time thinking about it, because, as I've said earlier, I am very pragmatic, and I recognize that no one knows what it really is.
Yeah.
And so I don't really think I had any preconceptions.
Mm. Your children, since you told them the story, I think, as they grew, and they heard some of the story. How has that formed who they are today, maybe in your relationship with Bill and all that? How's that unfolded?
I actually didn't tell them most of it, because, as I said, I think that not wanting to come back was an important part of it. But it certainly influenced the way I parented. I mean, spirituality and being obedient to God and thinking about following Christ's lead was part of every breath. I mean, it's what I am. And that certainly influences how I parent. It certainly influenced how I parent with regard to cherishing every moment with them. I came back with this understanding that my oldest son would probably die young, and I cherished every moment with each of my kids. With my husband, it was interesting because for him, it was a very different experience. He often said that I was off talking to God, but he was changing diapers, which is true. He was very busy and put one foot in front of the other, and it was a very emotional time for him. He's a guy, and he had very typical guy reactions. One of the overriding emotions for him at that time was this sense of failure, because he did not protect me. And the role of a guy is to protect his family. And so it was very difficult for him to actually talk about it. And I will tell you that he did not hear the whole story until the manuscript was going off to the publisher. And I handed it to him and I said, okay, this is my life and therefore our life. So if you want veto power, you need to read this. But it was very emotional for him, and reading about our son's death was very difficult for him.
Yeah.
But it has certainly changed the way that he experiences his spiritual life. Certainly with my children. They know it's real. They know I'm not a very creative person. They know I'm not fanciful and creative, and they've made fun of that my whole life.
You're a pragmatic mom.
I am, and so they know me, and therefore they know that everything I have told them is true.
What can you say to the audience that's out there? There's a lot of people out there, not just in this country, other countries, that that are going through tough times. They're going through challenges. What can you speak to them about your experience and how they can maybe experience that without having to go through what you went through?
We all face challenges. That is the nature of being here on earth. And I will say that I don't like challenges, but I embrace them. And through those challenges, I still maintain an absolute sense of joy, because I know, first of all, that whether I can recognize them or not, there really are beautiful ripple effects. But the other thing is that nobody ever changes when things are good. When things are good, who wants change?
Yeah.
It's not a surprise that typically we turn to Christ or we turn to God when we're on our knees, when we've been knocked down. And it's only during those times of challenge that people really grow and change and hopefully develop their spiritual life. You know, you can look at things throughout history and see the beauty in them. You can go back as far as Christ. I mean, that's a guy, doesn't even matter who you think Christ was, whether he's a son of God, prophet, man, it doesn't matter. That's a person who was betrayed by a best friend, arrested, beaten, humiliated, and murdered.
For doing good.
Yeah, and that, if that's something that happened today, of course it'd be all over the internet, all over the newspapers. We'd all be talking about it and wringing our hands. But the fact is, all these years later, we celebrate it. Even at the time, you know, his disciples were moping around, talking about how horrible it was. Well, we see our challenges from a very narrow perspective.
That's good.
And I really feel like you have to look at your life and make this transition into an absolute trust in order to truly look at challenging circumstances with a sense of joy.
That's good.
And I believe you can.
Which is the promises are assured in Christ.
Absolutely.
And I love that idea because God is in the darkness. He's in the challenge as much as He's in when we're winning the ball game.
Absolutely.
Whatever it is. That's wonderful. Now, what about this? This is interesting. You have a great story for those of faith, but also you have a story about this God, this Christ who loved you in that boat, not because of your performance, not because you went to some church service prior to say a prayer and all these things that you would think you had to do, or we've been taught many times you have to do,
right.
But you felt the tangible presence of God, of love around you. Your story, I believe, is going to send a message to those who've never even maybe heard of Christ.
Right.
Because of this experience. Talk about that, about this story, this message, getting to those that maybe have no framework of this God, this Christ.
Well, the fact is, whether people like it or not, God loves each of us on this planet as much as He loves me. And I may not like it. There are people I don't care for. Now, I will say that that's changed quite a bit since this experience. I truly try to see people the way God sees them. But the reality is there are people that, whether it's me or anyone else, you don't like, and you don't want God to love them because, for whatever reason. But the fact is, God created each of us and loves each of us dearly. And I think that reading my story can inspire people, again, to look at their own lives. The person who can get in the way of God's love is themselves. I mean, one of God's promises is that nothing can separate us from God's love. Mm. And I absolutely not only believe that's true, I know it's true, except I would put the little asterisks on the side. There is someone who can get in the way, and it's us.
It's us.
We don't feel lovable. We don't feel like God can forgive us. We don't feel like we've done enough. We're not good enough. And we just have to get out of the business of judging, which is what we're doing, whether it's judging someone else or whether it's judging ourselves. It's not our job.
Yeah, it's good.
We have jobs to do, and that is not one of them. That is God's job. And if you could get to the point where you get out of the business, focus on...
Get out of the judging business.
Exactly. Focus on doing what you're supposed to be doing and get out of the business of judging. I think it'll go a long way toward not only allowing each person to develop their relationship, but it will go a long way toward inspiring someone else to turn and seek God's face. Yeah. Because sometimes it may be that you or I or whomever is the only experience or the only exposure that someone has to a loving God.
Yeah. So basically, audience, your ripple effect of your life goes much further than you can ever see. So tap into God in you, God through you, and experience and watch what God will do in the ripple effect of your life. Mary, what is next for you? What is on the agenda? Is it just unfolding, or what's going on in the future?
I gave up trying to predict what happens tomorrow.
Yeah, that's good.
I truly live in the moment. Mm. I plan. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a live in the moment, forget about tomorrow.
Right.
I certainly plan for tomorrow, but I absolutely try the best I can to always be listening to where God is leading me.
Yeah. Audience out there, some of you are pastors, some of you have churches, some of you have influence, and you have an audience that can be inspired not only by the book, but having Mary come and speak at your event or you're at church. I really think it can be a real evangelical event because your story goes beyond a religious person who's now going to go and try to capture some more religious people. But your story is for real about a God who loves every person who's hearing this story and those who haven't yet. So we're just so thankful that we had the privilege to having you on our show. We know this is probably the first and second time now of more to come. And thank you so much for coming all this way to be with us.
Thank you. It's such a privilege. It really is.
Good to have you. Audience, thank you for being with us on the Converging Zone. We'll see you again soon.